to our second 2023 Giller Book Club. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I'll be your host for tonight and then for the remaining 12 book clubs. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. And it is my profound pleasure tonight to introduce you to our interviewer, Waubgeshig Rice. Waubgeshig is an author and journalist from the Waubgeshig First Nation. He has written 3 fiction titles, and his short stories and essays have been published in numerous anthologies. His most recent novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, was published in 2018 and became a national bestseller. He graduated from the journalism program, at the university formerly known as Ryerson in 2002, and spent most of his journalism career with the CBC as a video journalist and radio host. He left CBC in 2020 to focus on his literary career, and he now lives in Sudbury, Ontario with his wife and 2 sons, soon to be 3 children in about 2 weeks' time. And tonight, Wab will be interviewing Tsering Yangzom Lama, author of the 2022 shortlisted novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. Tsering is joining us all the way from Sweden tonight. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning there. And she was telling me how dark it is most of the day. So I have vowed not to complain about the gloomy weather here in Toronto. Anyway, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I don't want to waste any more of your time. So please join me in welcoming Wab and Tsering.
Good evening. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Daphna. Bonjour, I'm Waubgeshig Rice. You may call me Wab for short. It's an honor to continue the 2022 Giller Prize discussion with an author I admire greatly, and very eager to have this discussion about her phenomenal novel. So it is my great honor to introduce Tsering Yangzom Lama. Her best-selling debut novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, won the 2023 New Writers Award for fiction from the Great Lakes Colleges Association. A New York Times Summer Reads pick, her novel was shortlisted for the 2022 Scotiabank Giller Prize, longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and longlisted for the Toronto Book Awards. Tsering holds an MFA in writing from Columbia University, where she was a Tom's Fellow, Writing Fellow, and Teaching Fellow. She earned her BA in Creative Writing and International Relations from the University of British Columbia. She was born in Nepal and currently lives in Vancouver and at the moment in Sweden as well. A lifelong activist, Tsering is a storytelling advisor at Greenpeace International, where she guides and trains offices around the world in narrative strategy. So welcome, Tsering.
Thank you, Wab. Thank you to everybody. So happy to be here.
So before we get into our discussion, would you do us the honor of sharing a passage from We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies?
Sure. I'm just going to read from about a third of the way into my book, from Lamo's second section, Pokhara, Nepal, Temo Semakar, Tibetan Refugee Settlement, 1973. This is how the edges of our camp harden. We begin with the administrative building, pulling down the rotten grass-thatched walls, digging straight lines for a rocky foundation beneath the soil, mixing and slapping mortar with small sheets of metal in our palms. Climbing onto the roof, I see my old rope still holding the bamboo together. It gives me no pleasure to cut the still tight braids with my sickle, throw the dead, fraying grass into the gorge, and watch them float down for the goats and cows to pick through. From the flat hill overlooking our camp, I see the men lay down new roofs of corrugated tin sheets, putting in place small metal lakes that shine in the light. The sun multiplies before me and is never the same. Then the monsoon comes and the rain too has changed. Against our tin roofs, the rain is no longer soft, wet taps from the sky, slipping onto our skin at all hours. Now the rain is made of nails, raging, threatening, but never breaking through. People now say with pride, our camp makes noise in the rain. We have no country, but we have a sound. In the same breath, we wonder, why did we survive and not our kin? What separates us from the ones who were caught, who starved, who were lost in the mountains, who did not endure that last winter, of that last season of illness or melancholy? When I look around, I know the truth. Nothing separates us. We are not the strongest, smartest, or even the ones who wanted to live the most. It can only be the saint, the ancient gu that through a series of karmic outcomes we cannot fathom, came to reside in our camp amid our group of orphans and childless parents. This small figurine is precious because of all who have held him, wearing away at his gold patina and earthen body. On his form, we can see the traces of the devoted touch of so many people in places beyond our reach. The traces of my mother wrapping silk scarves around the gu, my father's faint and final breaths, the unrelenting winds of the border, the shells that pounded a village into dust, my grandfather's wrinkled temple, and how many before that. Here for 11 years, the saint has been carried from house to watch over our sick, our newly born, our betrothed, to enter into our dreams so we emerge with lost memories and premonitions. But Ashang Mingmar doesn't like to call the gu the nameless saint. Ashang Mingmar says we must find out his identity. We must take the gu to a place where learned people can tell us his name. Maybe we need to go all the way to Dharamsala, the seat of the exile administration and home of the precious one. But it won't be enough to have his name. After we know it, Ashang will want to offer the gu to a monastery rather than keep the saint here in such poor circumstances. Some have shared this worry privately, but none would dare oppose my uncle's decision. For who could deny that the gu should be in a grander place? Still, I cannot accept this. The saint must remain here, where he chose to come. If the saint belongs anywhere else, it is with Samphel, whose uncle was chosen as the gu's last keeper, and someday Samphel may return. I still think about him from time to time, that mysterious bliss that bloomed within my body when he first appeared along the river, how free I felt beside him, and how tethered I felt to him as well.
Thank you. Lots in that passage that we will dive into over the next 40 minutes or so. So thank you very much for sharing that. First off, congratulations on all your novel successes.
Thank you.
What's it been like, this journey that your book has taken you on? What's the positive response been like for you?
I think, it's hard to answer that question because I don't really know how I feel. Like there's a way in which writing a book like this, by yourself for many years, it's and under difficult circumstances sometimes, like at night, working multiple jobs in New York and, sometimes having discouraging feedback or whatever, you just keep going. And then there's a lot of doubt of whether you'll find an agent, whether you'll find a publisher. And I think I just kept going because I couldn't stop and I couldn't not do it anymore. But it's been really an incredible and surprising response for me. And I remember watching you read the jury citation, and that was a really moving experience for me. So I think that was the first time I cried since the book came out. So yeah. It's been wonderful. It's been really amazing.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, your book resonated so deeply with all of us, all five of us, and it was, a special honor to be able to feature your story on the shortlist. And we talked long about it. I can tell you that much over the course of last summer. You mentioned a moment ago, this story was years in the making. Can you tell us how it all began?
Yes. So I had worked in Toronto for 2 years as a community organizer, essentially, in the Tibetan freedom movement. Right after college, right after graduating from UBC, I moved to Toronto to work there. And during that time, I decided to go into the MFA program to try to really focus on writing. And it was an interesting movement from being really deep in my community, living, breathing our stories, our world, and feeling like that was the center of the world. And then going into Colombia, being in a space that was predominantly white, quite wealthy, and just feeling like, wow, all of that felt so central to me. And now it feels so far away and it feels so invisible and inaudible almost. And that actually drew me closer to that work, and it made me search for that work and more. And I think I started to write some short stories about Tibetans. And then in the second semester of my coursework, I started to imagine what it was like in the camps, the settlements that Tibetans lived in Nepal, way back, like before I was born, sort of in the early 60s. And I had very little information, very few photos to go off of. There's just really not a lot. And even in my family, there's just not a ton of discussion of that period. And I think it was that void that made me want to write about it. And also because I grew up going to those camps, visiting those camps, because my relatives lived there. And I was born outside of the camp. I was born in the capital, but I regularly would visit. And I loved those places. I found them to be really beautiful, and I thought they were really fun. And I thought, oh, it's like the one place where that's like ours. But I didn't know the history, and I didn't know all of the what actually happened there. And I think it was that curiosity, but also that sort of affection for a place that felt even less visible, like marginal among marginal areas. And so I just kept finding myself drawn to the places that were not visible to me or audible to me in the center of the literary world, which is New York City, in a creative writing program there, surrounded by giants, like professors that I was reading in the New Yorker, but everything that I had grown up with and everything that I'd just been steeped in was gone. And so that was the sort of push and pull that I was inside of when I started the novel.
And what was the span of that journey from your first ideas until it was published? How long was that?
Just about 10 years. Yeah. And even talking to most of my writing friends whose books came out around the same time, even for folks who wrote really 200-page short little novels, it seems to have taken that long. So I think it takes about 10 years to figure out who you are as a writer, or to perhaps work up the courage to speak in the way that you really want to. And the first 4 years, I feel like I was just kind of cranking out pages for workshops, and I did an extra teaching fellowship that allowed me to take additional workshops, and I was talking to mentors and stuff. So I was just cranking out pages, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was making the characters do things. And then in my graduation thesis seminar, where I had to turn in my pages, I really was asked the question, do I want to complete this book or not? And it was the first time somebody asked me that. And in their mind, there wasn't an assumed answer. And that really rattled me, because I was just continuing on. And I was like, no, I really do want to finish this. And at that point, I erased the whole thing and started over. And I think that's when I really committed to the process and committed to the book. And after that, it felt like, whatever it took, I was willing to do to finish it. And so that involved a lot of research. Again, as I said, I'm writing about a time and a place and a people that is not really served by historical record. There's just very little in the way of recorded history about refugees, Tibetan refugees in particular, and also a place that I cannot physically visit, which is a unique thing, I think, among writers, although exile is not a unique theme among writers. But I couldn't physically go there, but I could go to the border. So I took a trek to the border of Tibet and Nepal so I could experience the landscape. And, that really informed the last section of the book, and which was written very quickly because I had such direct knowledge of that place. And also drawing from Tibetan oral history. There's a Tibetan oral history project that's online on YouTube. Just watching those videos and sort of understanding who these people from that elder generation are. And many of them have gone now, but their stories are so precious. And I was able to sort of mix all of that, including my family's, what little that, I had been given from my parents and, what they were willing to share with me, sort of mix it all like confetti and just throw it against the wall and fill in the rest. And yeah, it was really a slow process of, rebuilding a place that I don't know and cannot know. but trying to make it as true as possible within what I was capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something really important there about approaching a void and trying to fill it in when, you know, people around you or your ancestors didn't talk about it that much because of the trauma of colonialism and of displacement. And when you're exploring a story like that, you have to do it very properly and respectfully, and it's going to take some time, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, I decided to do this project, so I took on that huge story, I guess, of the invasion, the colonization, the loss. I mean, it's a 5-decade story, and you know, I'm not. And I admire writers who can say, like, there's no such thing as responsibility. I'm just here to, like, have fun. And I get that. I love that. You know, like, I admire that stance of defiance and, like, being an iconoclast. But I'm also, like, really conscious of, like, the fact that this is an important community that I'm trying to speak to rather than speak of. And I want this book to ring true to them. And I want this to be a resource, it's, you know, in some way, you know, and even though it's a work of fiction, to me, it is a work of history as well. There can be many forms of history, I think. And when you rewrite the past in the way that writers do, there's a way in which you're projecting into the future too. The past, you know, our conception of the past is so important for our conception of what's possible in the future. And so I wanted it to be really thoughtfully done. And I wanted it to be informed by, you know, whatever I could find, and to be responsible to that community, to be accountable to them.
Yeah. Well, especially when, you know, so many of us, we've had our past stolen from us, and we have to rebuild our future however we can by any means necessary. Now, you mentioned the story spanning 5 decades. It spans 3 generations, spans continents. It goes from Tibet and Nepal to, you know, in the 60s to the 70s to the 80s and into Toronto, and then finally ends up in 2012. It's quite epic in scope, this story. What goes into building all that and creating that world?
I think the most important thing is to find the structure and the shape and the form. And especially when you have something so large that you're working with, a canvas so large, and especially, I mean, I have like 4 characters, and in each of them has their perspectives. So I'm also trying to enter into 4 perspectives and really embody each of their stories and try to get to know each of them as well as possible. So I need to find a structure that could organize the book in a way that helped me out a little bit. So, and also, like, reflected my perspective as a writer and the perspective of the novel. And so the sisters, lovers, you know, self, like that structure that's quite relational, in which, like, each character which has that relationship is featured in that section. And also going back and forth between 2 time zones, it sort of allowed me to think of, you know, think of things that I didn't need to talk about and think of things that I did need to talk about, and give myself a form that could manage so much. And the other thing that was really important for me was to find the texture of the book through the themes and the patterns that kept emerging. So, you know, the nameless saint is a god and also a statue that appears and disappears repeatedly throughout the book in each of the characters' perspectives. And he becomes a sort of a theme, like a narrative theme, in the sense that he reflects the sort of the magic that is in our culture, which is something that I think isn't necessarily known that much, but, like, it's something that is real to us. And he also kind of connects everybody. And this is a God that chooses to move into exile with the characters. And so having something like that as just as a craft thing is really helpful when you have a novel that's so vast with such like far-flung characters. Having something that appears and disappears throughout all of the sections, it was really helpful. And I think I figured that out about halfway through the writing process. So, and then there was just a lot of, rebuilding the book every time I found out new things. When I learned more about the oracular tradition, which is really ancient, and Tibet is, as old as the Greek oracles. And the role women had, especially in villages. This was one of the few spaces where women could be outside of a patriarchal system, in a sense, like where they're not beholden to their father or their husband or their son. They live a life of independence financially, and also they have a lot of power and say. Even though they're acting as vessels, they're deeply connected to their communities and their leaders and their healers. So when I learned more about that, that informed how I, at that point I brought in the mother's character, who really wasn't there that much before. So as I learned more and more, as I researched more and more, as I found photographs here and there online from the camps, all of these things changed it. Like, for instance, I found a photo from the 1970s where there was, when I saw the roads outside one of the camps, and the roads were still gravel. And so then I had to go and change things so that it was more accurate. So things like that, it was just really slow building and adding texture through the themes and the patterns and the motifs that were appearing to me through my research.
Yeah, so interesting. I wanted to ask you a little more about those spiritual elements. Lama and Tenki's mother is an oracle, as you mentioned. There is the nameless saint that, serves as a guide or as a touchstone of sorts for them throughout their, forced exodus and so on. When writing about spiritual things like that, it can be pretty sensitive from culture to culture, right? Mm-hmm. And speaking from my perspective as an Anishinaabe person, we write about certain cultural things, but there are certain ceremonial things that we don't write about that we keep in ceremony and so on. So when you're writing a novel of the scope that's been read around the globe, how do you navigate what to share and what to keep within the community?
Yeah, that's really, really important question. And I think it's like you were saying, there are a lot of people who have written about my community too, for centuries actually. And often, like when non-Tibetans write about Tibet, they focus on the spirituality or the religion, and they do it from this like almost exotic perspective of like, look at this. And, whereas I really wanted to write about it from an everyday perspective of like what it's like to live in this world and not treat it as a strange thing to believe in premonition or to believe that the land could be holy, and also to write about the displacement of that and the shock of living in multiple worldviews at once. So on the one hand, I had to think about how the characters would think about the spiritual aspect. For Lama and Tenki, it's deeply embodied in their worldview because they grew up in Tibet, and they, although they have lived in exile, they are closer to it. For Doma, she's struggling with it back and forth, and she has a more of a Western perspective, which is challenged and changes by the end. And then for Samfel, he's really disillusioned, and he's sort of a gruff, disillusioned man, like for many good reasons, and does not identify necessarily with that tradition or that perspective, even though he was a monk at one point. And so I thought about each character as real human beings and where they stand, and understanding that there isn't just one way of relating to spirituality or your culture or your heritage. And then I had to also think about this in terms of the novel's perspective, like my perspective. And I am writing from all of those perspectives that the characters have. I hold all of that within me. I am all of those people. And I'm also not all of those people. So, you know, that's the fun of writing a novel. And that's especially the fun of having multiple perspectives, I would say, is that you get to tap into that part of you. And I think as a whole, the novel does respect the perspective of the Tibetan spirituality as a whole. You know, I'm writing from that culture. I'm writing from that history and that like childhood and like my family and things like that. So, and I wanted the book to be like, you know, as you said, like regenerative. I wanted it to be, you know, I'm not writing to like make people depressed. I want to remind people of the beauty and the joy and also like what's precious.
Yeah. Well, that comes through so clearly and vibrantly, and I think that distinct humanity is just so clear in each of the four characters. Not just how they respond to the spiritual elements, but how they exist as individuals, right? So by portraying that diversity amongst Tibetans, what do you hope people in the Tibetan diaspora take away from your characters and the rest of the story, just in general?
Well, the first thing is that, like, you know, I was really worried about how the Tibetan community would respond because, you know, we don't have a ton of novels. And, you know, I'm sort of choosing to put stuff out there. And I was, you know, that's why it took a long time to really make sure the research was solid. And one of the first people to read it was my professor, who's like an eminent Tibetan historian. And I was really worried about what he would say. And I was relieved that he was happy with the book. So first of all, I just didn't want them to hate it and like think that it was like total nonsense. You know, I wanted it to ring true to them. I wanted it to feel like they could recognize the characters. And then I guess the more lofty goal, you know, writing a book is about looking for language to talk about an experience. To as I said, like recast history through new words or through a new configuration of words, and that's a slow process, and that's it's an offering into a community, and hopefully like those words resonate and they become something that people can draw from. And so that was my really brought like greater hope, was that I was fashioning new language that could be useful to Tibetans in exile.
I'll just remind our audience that in about 15 minutes, we will take some of your questions. So feel free to add some in the Q&A box down there, and I'll pass them along as they come. So talking, you know, about the Tibetan community globally and how you connected, you know, with readers there. You know, me personally, as someone who has invasion, displacement, cultural theft, and so on in my own ancestry, obviously I've related with a lot in this story, even though, you know, it happened so far away from my homelands. So when you're able to reach people outside your own community who see these, who feel these similar things and can connect with these themes, what's that like for you?
It's really important to me. You know, I think like this whole decolonial thing is a struggle that we're all involved in, and we're engaged in a personal level. And there's so many parallels, you know, between sort of the experiences of Indigenous communities, not just in Canada, the US, Australia, elsewhere, in South America, and Tibetans. You know, on a basic level, the things that have happened to Tibet are taken from the blueprint of like what's happened in the West and in colonized nations. So the same things are happening now that have happened in the past here in Canada, right? So for instance, stealing children and assimilating them in order to allow people to erase an identity and thus remove a people from their land, or the connection from their land. That's happening in Tibet right now with 800,000 Tibetan children who have been recently stolen and put into boarding schools and told they can't speak Tibetan and so forth. And that sort of nomadic resettlement is a process that's been ongoing for the last decade or so. So our oppressions are linked in that way, in that like very directly, the Chinese government is copying the things that have worked. But I also think our liberation is linked. You know, I think that like it matters to all of us that there's success, hard won changing of discourse in Canada and elsewhere through activism for decades by Indigenous peoples. That matters because we're all drawing from that well of discourse. We're all drawing from that well of language and conversation, and shaping how people think about these things and talk about these things. And so when something changes in one place, it helps all of us. And so, you know, I see the linkages both in the problems and in our survival. And so, you know, I think writing is an offering to a discourse, an offering to a conversation. And so I've drawn from that well, certainly. And this is sort of my way of like adding a drop into it.
Well, it's very inspirational for sure, and it takes a lot of courage, and it's a very honorable thing to speak up against the oppressor and to resist in that way. How do you think a novel, and yours specifically, can serve as a force for change, or as, you know, a link in that chain of resistance?
I think first and foremost, it's a form of nourishment for the community that is, you know, I hope reflected in that book. Like, you know, I think that, you know, in the long term, the survival of any people is really something that depends upon those people. And so storytelling, you know, not just novels, but like a much older form of storytelling, which is the oral tradition. You know, I don't put that beneath the written tradition or, you know, literature in that sense. Storytelling in the broader sense is like so vital to a community's sense of who they are and their history and what's possible in the future. And again, like finding the language and the touch points and the patterns and the motifs and the themes and so forth. So I think a novel is a part of that. It's not the most important. It's certainly perhaps not going to be forever the space that people work in, although I love the written word. But it's a part of that formation of the community's sort of self-identity, I guess, or like sense of self. And then, you know, I'm really conscious of obviously the fact that I can't write directly to Tibetans. It's a kind of a unique situation because I'm using the mechanisms and the structures of Canadian publishing to communicate with not only the world, but also with Tibetans in exile, and then, you know, like slowly seeping into Tibet itself. And so I'm cautious of the fact that I have to speak both to Tibetans, non-Tibetans, anybody who will listen, anybody who will care to read the book. And so I do want that. I want to reach as many people as possible. And in that space, I would like as many people as possible to sit for 12 to 15 hours inside of these characters' lives, inside of their minds, inside of their bodies, and to imagine themselves, to identify with them. I think that is a power of literature. I don't think that in itself is change. I don't think reading a book changes the material conditions of any of the people that I'm talking about. Their lives are not bettered by just reading a book, but I think it's an essential part of identification and like, you know, getting outside of our day-to-day experiences. So for all the people that are reading the book, whether or not they have come from a colonial experience, like an experience of colonization or displacement, I hope that they can recognize like the complexity and the true spirit that like comes from surviving something like that and continuing to survive something like that. I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think it's there's much the world can learn from communities like ours.
Oh yeah, totally agree. There are a lot of questions coming in, so I want to get to those. I only have a few left for myself. I wanted to ask you specifically about Dalma, as sort of the more, I guess, modern character, you could say, who really embodies that decolonial spirit, I think, in a lot of ways. What she comes up against in terms of the ignorance of the Toronto Academy or some of her peers even. Were you able to draw upon some of your own personal experience when writing about her?
Yeah, of course. I definitely, that one, although I have to say, at first I sort of made Dolma quite a bit younger and more of a cartoon character, like, this was early on. And choosing to give Dolma the intelligence that she has, choosing to really take her seriously was, I guess, me trying to take, aspects of myself that relate to Dolma seriously as well, and having compassion for her experience and where she stands at a distance from her parents' experiences, but also trying to survive and trying to succeed in very understandable young person ways inside of the country that she is in Canada, and then recognizing slowly this coming closer to the disillusionment that she does, that this one world itself will not give her everything she needs or give her everything she seeks, and that she's going to have to forge her own path and her own place between worlds. And so I definitely, having gone to different academies and been in these elite spaces, could draw from personal experiences, although none of that was directly relayed in the book. I did also talk to good friends of mine who are in academia in Tibetan studies to kind of get a sense of maybe things have changed, because I was in those classes, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And, things have not changed, although I think the rhetoric has changed, the language sounds, loftier and more friendly. But in some ways things have gotten worse. And so it reminded me that this is important. And one thing that I've been really encouraged by as well is how this book has started to make waves in some spaces like that, Tibet studies scholars are reading the book and are inviting me to their universities to talk, and most importantly, young Tibetan academics are reading the book and are reaching out to me. So, the situation has not changed as profoundly as I would hope, but there are more and more young Tibetans in that space, and I think that's another area of discourse shaping that's really important.
Yeah, that's another victory along the way, right?
Yeah.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
I see that my editor is here, so hi, Anita. I've been thinking about this bigger project for about a year, and it's really more of a I guess it's more of a magical historical novel, really farther back in history along the Silk Road, and it's about a nomadic community that decides to settle. And that's been a big research process, and I'm sort of letting that sort of simmer on the side, and I'm now working more on some short pieces, some short stories. There are themes and things that are in this novel that I'm not done with. Characters, places. Not that I want to write a sequel or anything yet, but necessarily, but I want to sort of find little specks to explore and to let them flower in whatever direction they may be calling to me. So I'm sort of in a space of exploration, I guess, is the long and the short of it. Just having fun and writing whatever comes to mind.
Well, that's exciting too.
Thanks.
So what we always like to do before we let you go is ask for any book recommendations, anything you're reading now or anything you want to highlight. Would you mind sharing that with our audience?
Yes, sure. So one book that I read recently is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf is a writer that I've always found very difficult to read. She's not an easy writer, and she's modernist and really hard to get into. And sometimes you're just read 5 pages and I'm like, what just happened? Where am I? And, you know, but this book, I feel like there's sometimes a moment when you're in the right state of receptivity to receive a book. And after many years of trying to read Virginia Woolf, I read Orlando recently, and this is such a funny book. And it's about a character who is gender fluid, who changes genders, starting out as a man and becomes a woman and lives for centuries. And the way Virginia Woolf does this is with such humor and intelligence, and it's like wildly imaginative and creative. And she talks about, like, you know, decades of history in these like beautiful, sweeping ways. And I think this is a book that could be a pathway into Virginia Woolf for other readers like me, who found her other works a little difficult. Another writer that I didn't know about recently, actually, is Simone Vay. She was a French philosopher, theorist, mystic. And in this book, I didn't know anything about Simone Vay until recently, and now she's popping up everywhere. But my partner bought this book, and then I took it from his hand and just like read the whole thing on the train ride home. And she's just so powerfully clear and writes in this almost aphoristic way. And I think that she's really concerned with suffering, like why we suffer and why we allow others to suffer. And she was somebody who really lived her morals and her values in a way that, like, I don't think I could. And I just found her writing to be so clear and to be so inspiring. I also read T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets recently. And T.S. Eliot, I don't have that with me, but I read it at a library. He's another writer that I find very difficult to read, mostly because of how he was taught to me in college, from the perspective of like scholars who want to say, like, what does this text mean? And they're so concerned with decipherment and comprehensibility. And it really takes the joy out of T.S. Eliot, I feel like. And I just happened to like come across an anthology of his in a library, and I pulled it out and I opened it, and it opened in the first page of The Four Quartets. And I sat down and I read the whole thing. And then I read it again. So I read it twice, just sitting in that library, because I was just so taken with the images, and also like okay with the mystery of it, which I think is like a real artist's way of approaching poetry, as opposed to like a scholarly way of approaching poetry. And I don't think T.S. Eliot can be deciphered anyway. So again, like I was in the right moment in my life to take on these texts and to approach them with a state of receptivity that allowed for me to approach them on my own terms. And then I have to say, I read your book recently, and I absolutely loved it. I recognize so many parts of this, just, you know, because it's about a small community living in relative isolation. And one of my favorite parts was, I don't even know if you meant this to be funny, I'm sure you did, but there was a part where Walter is at a meeting and he's sort of talking about, you know, the shortages. And, you know, there's somebody heckling in the back, and he says, you know, this is terrible. I won't quote exactly, but he's sort of angry about having to share food. And then Walter gets really upset and starts screaming and, you know, like really gets, I guess, stressed out. And then somebody from the back of the room, and Walter apologizes, and somebody from the back of the room says, "It's okay, Walter." And it could have been the same heckler, but there's that feeling of like, sort of this like compassion and like understanding of each other's emotional states, and that allowance for each other to be human beings that I just really loved. And I'm so excited that it's longlisted and that you know, you have another book coming out soon. So I'll be eagerly awaiting that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm honored. That's great. Yeah, I'm glad you connected with that too, because I think in times of crisis or catastrophe, when you know you're a community that has already endured so much, you sort of have to find that brevity for survival, right?
Exactly. You know? And like the crisis for some communities has already happened or has been happening. You know, I think there's a way in which people in the West talk about like the climate crisis, which is an issue I work on. They talk about it as if it's this first time or it's this new crisis. And they're like, what are we going to do? You know, I don't know how we should feel about this moment that is utterly unique. And it is unique in many ways, but for some communities, the catastrophe happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and has been a continual experience of surviving inside of a catastrophe. So it was an important reminder of like the ways in which so many communities around the world have had to survive, and also have a sort of an ability to, or a memory of how to reconnect with those reserves of experience and stories, and also old knowledge of how to survive.
Oh, definitely. Well, thanks for the shout out. That's very cool. I appreciate it. So I'll go to the questions from the audience. The first one here is more of a comment. It's from Judith Roy. She says, I absolutely loved this book and gave it to several people for Christmas. It's a book to treasure. I so appreciate the insights that Tsering shares with us through this novel. We had the great fortune to meet a young woman from Nepal shortly after reading the book. She'd arrived in Canada on a scholarship. I would have given her my copy of Tsering's book if I had not already loaned it out. She's beautiful and author to follow. So thanks for that, Judith.
Thank you, Judith.
The question here from Christine Tully. Has anyone approached you to turn this novel into a movie?
No, they haven't. I think we would need somebody really intrepid, because at least in my understanding of Hollywood, it's become quite difficult to put out a movie about Tibet. And there was a period in which, like Kundun and 7 Years in Tibet, there were some movies that were being made, but it's become increasingly difficult to get the funding and the allowances to create a movie about an issue that is so sensitive.
Thank you. Here's another question. Thanks for this great conversation. I really enjoyed how you chose to weave the quote unquote present narrative, the 2012 sections, in with each of the book's 4 parts. What was the intent behind this decision?
Well, I think on a basic level, I wanted to draw a line, make a connecting thread between the past and the present moment, and think about how we got from there to here. And then another way, the weaving itself is a way for me to convey how the past is always here, and how these characters are always living inside of their past, whether as like memories and sort of like points of trauma that are unresolved or whatever, or in the void of the past, in the recognition of all they can't know. A lot of the time in writing this book was also trying to understand who my characters were, and sort of, I guess, in a way, like writing and listening for the false notes, and finally listening to make the characters audible to me so that I could hear them, because it took a long time for me to hear them and their voices, especially writing in the first person. It's so important. And then in that, I recognized how unknowable they had to be to each other, as well. The unknowability of each, that we experience as human beings is something that's true for the characters too. It takes a long time for us to get to know each other as people, and there's so much that we can't know about each other. And I wanted to convey that, and I think having that woven storyline with also the big gulfs in between was a way for me to convey the distance and the silence that sort of is emblematic of like exile life, and life of like a displaced person.
Thank you. Here's a question from Taya Yuming. My apologies if I mispronounce your name. What do you think of casting a community who has experienced oppression due to displacement and colonialism, such as Tibetans, as resilient? Do you feel it traps people within a framework of oppression and pressures people to not recognize collective struggles? Or do you feel that it's helpful in lifting a community up? I've noticed a lot of discussion on this lately.
Well, I think resilience is like in response to like profound trauma and suffering, right? So that resilient spirit is only, I guess, is forged through that experience of trauma and suffering. You don't really hear about like the resilience of like really terrible people who like don't suffer and like live lives of like utter luxury, right? They tend to be pretty fragile and like, I guess like victims of their own egos and their own like ignorance, really. The fact that they're not exposed to other people and other experiences in the way that like if you are a marginal figure in whatever community you are, you not only see your experience, but you see the experiences of people who have greater power than you very clearly. You see them as who they are. And that's the kind of double consciousness that, people talk about, that you hold both your perspective and the perspective of the society or the sort of the status quo or the dominant group. You see it clearly. And so, I think Tibetans, like so many people, are, it's interesting because Tibetans often talk about, we have this narrative inside of our community about like how we're like very successful refugees. And I think it's a story we tell ourselves because we are very successful refugees. And the fact that like we had almost nothing and no great power, no great nation stood up with us or did anything to even like, except for like Ireland and Uruguay, I think, who like were like, no, we don't support this invasion. Nobody else supported our narrative that we had been invaded. Nobody cared. And yet we somehow were able to rebuild everything, like in terms of in exile, a government in exile, schools, old people's homes, a monastic system, all of our language, and preserving all of that in exile. But I think we as a community haven't really acknowledged our own trauma, which is the thing that some of my Tibetan friends have really resonated with in terms of this book is this, is one of the few spaces in which the trauma of ordinary Tibetans is discussed, because we don't talk about that.
Yeah, it's a long journey, right? The trauma response takes a long time, for sure. Here's a question from Marta. How did you discover your writing talent?
I don't know that I have any, I wouldn't say there was a discovery of any innate talent or anything. I was just always just a big nerd and a big reader. And I remember when I was like 7 or 8 in Nepal, I wrote a poem about impermanence, or the idea of impermanence. I don't remember what the poem is, or I don't have a copy of it, but my dad, who's passed away now, but he at the time was just a very encouraging parent. And he was like, this is just incredible. I'm going to get this published for you. And I was like, I thought he was just joking. And then like a couple of days later, it was in the main newspaper in the city. And so there was this, I guess there was this idea that he was a big dreamer and he thought that anything was possible. And it took me a long time. It took me many decades to believe in that myself. But I think I remembered that there was this possibility that like if you write something, it can be published somewhere. But I think more important than talent is persistence and discipline and community, and and I think I found those through the space of like writing programs where I could meet other writers. And that's not necessarily the path for everybody. It's a privilege to be able to do that kind of thing. But for me, I had to build in the daily practice of writing and also have writer friends who we could commiserate with. And that was more sustaining for my writing practice than like any sort of innate talent or anything like that I could discover about myself. It's more of like determination and grit and like camaraderie.
Yeah, very important too, that community of writers that you can form.
Yeah.
This is a question from Eric Jose. You touched on this a bit in terms of structuring the novel in those 3 sections in 3 different eras. But Eric's question is specifically about Lama. What's Lamo's significance as the one character that's returned to for all 3 of the book sections?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, Lama is a figure that has her feet in both worlds. She is the older sister among 2 sisters who leaves, and she has a real awareness of everything that's happening. The younger sister is brilliant and really set up to be like a leader and an educator and all of these things in her community, but she has almost the farthest to fall, and she has a very difficult life. and Lama was kind of always the outsider. She's sort of always observing, and I think that's a useful character for a writer to have as an intermediary, I guess. So Lama is, yeah, she has her feet in both worlds, in both moments. And also she's an observer and an inherent outsider in her community. She likes to sit on the edge of her camp and with her legs dangling over the river gorge and just think. And she has memories of her parents, which Tenki doesn't as well. That's helpful.
I think we have time for one more, maybe two more, but this is a question from a Queen's University student, and I want to make sure to give some space to our young people, our students. They're working on a group project on your novel. We all loved your book. My question for Tsering is, and you sort of touched on this in your response about resilience, but my question for Tsering is, what role did trauma and or post-traumatic stress have when developing your characters and the novel as a whole? Are there any specific characters that you set out to highlight this harsh reality of displacement, exile, and survival?
Well, thank you so much, and I'm appreciate that you're here and that you're doing this project on my book. That's amazing. It's interesting because like the language of trauma is, I think, fairly alien to the community that I'm writing about. It's not necessarily the framework that they would use, but it's something that I wanted to draw out. I think most Tibetans, many Tibetans think about our struggle. The struggle is more of the word. It's like, what we're trying to do as a community. We're engaged in something together. We're trying to inform the world about our situation, or we're trying to free our country, survive against colonization and oppression. And that inward reflection about trauma is something that is not, I think, as much of a space. So I had to reflect that in my characters. They don't sit around thinking about their traumas. They don't sit around talking about their traumas, but it's still there because they're human beings. And I think their suffering, just as I said, like, Tibetans talk about the struggle is outward facing. So it's like when they experience trauma, they're also outward facing. They look to each other in community, if possible. If they have that access to that community, they look to each other to survive and to find companionship and to find kinship. And it's when you move to the West and you become quite isolated and atomized, which I think a lot of people in the West are, unfortunately, quite lonely, you lose that one thing that is so important for trauma, which is connection, is to have deep connection with human beings, at least one person, like a deep connection with one person who really understands you and who cares. And so that trauma is not just over there in Tibet or in the loss of a country. That trauma is also in moving to a new country and losing connection with that community that really understands you, but you have to do it because you can't live over there. So, and then you have to find new community in Canada. So there's so many layers to that. And it's something that I'm still thinking about, so yeah.
And just one last question for me that I wanted to wrap everything up with. Speaking of connection, I've seen on your Instagram how you connect with the community, the Tibetan community in various places wherever you go, whether it's to do a reading for them or a writing workshop. What's that like for you to have those opportunities?
It's really important. And, I get invitations from communities when I'm not even there. Like I was in Switzerland for a writing residency and someone from Paris wrote me and asked if, somehow he found out where I was, although I hadn't posted on social media that I was in Switzerland, and he found out my contact information and he asked me to come to Paris to talk to the Tibetan community there. And I did. And, it's just like, to me, this is, I think something very precious and very unique, and I think it's really important to connect with people just like who share the same history as you, and reminding them that there's no special magic in that I possess, that we're I just got down to business, and we're all getting down to business here. So I'm here and I'm with them, and we're doing it together. And And you know, so it's just nice to connect and meet each other and have frank conversations as people who can have that kind of conversation.
Read on. Well, Tsering, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. It was a real pleasure and an honor to chat with you. And I'll bring Daphne back in.
Hi, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Tsering. This was an amazing hour. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed hearing from these two extraordinary individuals as much as I did. And for those of you who know people who missed it or couldn't stay for the whole evening, please be aware that this interview is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel over the next couple of days. And please join us in about 2 weeks' time on February 7th to hear another jury member, Kai Kellogg, interview Rawi Haj, who was the author of another shortlisted book, this time a short story collection called Stray Dogs. If you've subscribed to our book club mailing list, you'll be sent a registration notification. And if not, just visit our website for some more information. Again, thanks, Wab. Thanks, Tsering. Have a great evening, or a good sleep in your case, Tsering.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Daphne and Emma, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.